I'd like to introduce you to Júlia Mir Pedrol from the University of Tübingen. Stage is yours, Júlia.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. I'm Júlia, and I'm here to talk about how you can use the NF validation plugin for the validation of pipeline parameters and input files. So in Nextflow, we have this special variable called params, which is used to launch workflows providing different parameters or inputs and settings for every run. And also, it's very common to use a sample sheet. This is a file used to provide all the sample-dependent information, such as file paths, sample IDs, or other metadata. So Nextflow doesn't provide an integrated functionality for this validation. That's why pipeline developers should have to write several codes to validate this. In the NF Core community, we started developing some Groovy code to validate these inputs, but in order to extend this to all Nextflow pipelines, we developed the NF validation plugin. This uses the JSON schema format to provide all the validation rules. So in the NF validation plugins, we have different functions that you can import to your main Nextflow script and use them. For example, the first one we have params help, which will print a help message to the terminal when a user uses the param help. Then we also have param summary log, which will print a log of all the provided parameters that differ from a default value. To actually validate these parameters, we have validate parameters. And then we can also validate the content of input files, such as sample sheets, automatically with validate parameters or from sample sheet, which is our last function. This one can also be used, or can be used to create Nextflow channels from the contents of these files. So as I mentioned, we use JSON schema format. If you are familiar with JSON schemas, you will see that we have some particularities that differ a little bit from the standard schema. For example, with use grouping, this is useful to organize the parameters and make the outputs look nicer. And with this schema, you can validate several things. For example, the type of your parameters, if they are strings or integers. You can also specify which parameters are required. And for example, for strings, provide patterns or minimum and maximum length. And then other particularities that we have is this help text. With this, you can provide a longer help message, which can support markdown formatting to help the users a little bit better, or error messages, which will be usually more explanatory than the default error message. And finally, let me bring your attention to the last keyword schema. I'll talk about this in following slides. This is used to provide the path to a second schema file, which will be used to validate the contents of an input file provided through this parameter. So because of all these particularities and to avoid errors when creating this Nextflow parameter schema, it's recommended that you don't do it manually, but in NF Core tools, we provide some functionality with this NF Core schema build that will help you create this parameter schema using a graphical interface. So as we have seen with this parameter schema, we can validate our parameters, generate help text and logs, but on top of that, it can also be used to generate documentation. For example, that's what we use in the NF Core website. For every pipeline, we have a page describing all the parameters. And it's also useful for launching pipelines, helping the users provide their parameters through a user interface. Let's move to file validation. First of all, thanks to Nicholas, who contributed with this feature. So as I mentioned, with this keyword schema, we can provide the path to a second schema file that will validate the contents of an input file or a sample sheet. And the same schema is also used for the creation of an input channel. So you can validate CSV, TSV, and simple YAML files, and each property, in this example we have field 1 and field 2, will validate a column of a CSV or TSV or an entry of a YAML file. Apart from validating all the same things that we could validate with a parameters schema, such as type or required fields, we have some special keywords First one is meta. So in channels, it's very common to have a meta map, which will hold all the metadata information. With this keyword meta, you can specify that your field needs to be stored in this meta map. Then we also have unique that will validate that all the values from one field are unique. Deprecated to throw a deprecation message. And finally, dependent required, which is very useful, for example, if field 2 is required only if field 1 is provided. So let's see an example to understand a little bit better how this works. This is a very reduced schema for space purposes, but we have a sample sheet with 2 samples, and each of them has the sample ID, 2 files, and strandedness. And here in our main.nf, we are importing the function from sample sheet from the plugin, and then we are using it to create an input channel called channel input. And in this case, as an argument, we provide the name of the parameter that will be used to provide this file. In this case, it's input. So if you see below in the Nextflow command, we use input to give the path of our sample sheet. Then in this example, sample ID and strandedness are metadata. So that's here we are using the keyword meta, specifying the name of the key in the map that will store these values. And then in the output, we are seeing the channel. So you see we have a map with my sample ID and my strandedness. And then everything that's not a meta value will be added to the channel in the same order as it's specified in the schema. In this example, we have first FASTQ1 and then FASTQ2. So all this was for channel creation, but at the same time, it is also validating the values. We are validating that our values are strings. For FASTQ1, we have a pattern. Then for strandedness, we have the 3 possible values that it can have. And finally, sample FASTQ1 and strandedness are required. So to prove that this plugin can make your life easier, we are going to quickly see 2 real-life examples. First of all, in NF-Core RNA-seq. So as I mentioned, in the NF-Core template, we have some code already to validate the input parameters, which is this Groovy file. So when we were able to remove all this code and use the NF validation plugin, we could remove more or less 600 lines and add less than 200. And for sample sheet validation and the creation of the input channel, we were using a sub workflow with a module and a Python script that was doing all this validation. So when we replaced that for the plugin, we could also reduce around 200 lines of code. In the case of Zarek was already using some Groovy and not these Python scripts to validate their inputs, but still we could have an improvement of almost 100 lines of code, and there's still margin for improving that, which leads me to my last slide, the next steps. So thank you to everyone who started using this plugin in the community and provided a lot of feedback. We already have some perspectives to keep improving. First of all, our plan is to provide some tooling to create these sample sheet schemas, because now currently NF-Core tools provides tooling to create the Nextflow parameter schemas, but not the sample sheets. And finally, this conditional validation, which will be very useful for several pipelines where they need to validate some parameters. So the validation of some parameters depends on the value of other parameters. And I hope you now have an overview of what you can do with the NF validation plugin. Thank you to everyone who helped with contributions and the development of this plugin. And you can find documentation and get in touch with us in both Nextflow and NF-Core Slacks in the channel NF validation. Thank you.
So thanks, Julia, for the talk. So there's a question, we have time for one question from Adam, saying, who validates the validators? It seems to be using vanilla JSON, schema, the variable, not one that includes the Nextflow extensions that have been added. So we have anything to...
So for validation, we use the JSON library, which does this validation of the parameters. And what was the second?
I think he's referring maybe to either to split JSON operator or something like this. You're using like vanilla JSON. Was that very clear?
To validate the JSON schemas?
Yeah.
So with the tooling that we use, we provide to create this JSON schema. It will generate like a valid schema, and then you can also validate that your schema has a proper format.
Okay. Thank you.